Hello, everyone. It is time for my annual ranking of the drivers at the end of the season. I will be doing this in the form of a tier list. I have 5 categories this year. I have cut above, standout, good, inconsistent, and get out, leave. Shout out JoJo, as I always do every year. Very niche reference. All right, let's get right to this then. First up here is Alex Albon, and he is going into inconsistent. I think Alex didn't have as strong of a season as he did in 2023. I think part of this was down to bad luck, but he also just crashed so much more, and it really cost Williams in terms of development and in terms of points finishes. At least in the first half of the season, he was able to do a better job of it than Logan, but once Colapinto came in, I think Alex also seemed to have a little bit more pressure put on him when that happened, and so that was kind of when his crashes really started to happen, especially Brazil. But yeah, at least Alex had a few good weekends, Baku I think being the biggest standout. Next up is Fernando Alonso, and Fernando I am putting in good. I don't know if it was just that Aston Martin didn't really get much coverage this year, but it just seemed like it was really tough to tell how good of a season Fernando was having. I think the first half of the year he definitely capitalized when the Aston Martin was actually good compared to the other cars, but in the second half it really tailed off. And so he wasn't able to score as many points as he kind of did at the start of the year. So he kind of did the best with the car he had. Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say he had a standout year, especially compared to 2023, but I think he was able to put a consistent effort in and finish in the lower points quite consistently. Next up is Carlos Sainz, and I have Carlos in standout. Carlos had a few weekends in 2024 where he was just unbelievable and was even outperformed Charles and was like the best driver of the weekend. That happened in Australia, wildly coming back after his appendicitis. And then Mexico and Vegas were both pretty strong as well, but yeah, I think he also had a few race weekends where he was just absolutely nowhere. I think any kind of wet weather races, Carlos is not very good. So Canada, he spun out and took out Albon, and then Brazil was just horrible. He crashed in qualifying and the race there. I think he did quite well, and without that appendicitis, he might have finished closer to Charles than he ended up finishing. Next up, speak of the devil, is Charles Leclerc, and this might be a bit of a controversial take, but for me, Charles is the driver of the season. I think that if not for the 4 races in the middle of the season where that Ferrari just completely went the wrong direction, Charles might have had one of the most consistent seasons we've ever seen. He, outside of those 4 races, he finished in the top 5 in every single race. He never had a points finish that was below P5, and he even only had 3 P5 finishes. Other than that, he was like basically always on the podium or just in 4th. So just an insanely consistent season from him. We saw incredible tire management. We saw better strategy decisions apart from those races that he was struggling in, especially Canada. I think he made a couple poor calls there. And then he didn't really have his once a year bottle job either. Plus he managed to finally win Monaco. He won Monza. And I think looking at his season overall from a consistency perspective, I think he was the best driver. We will get to who you think probably should finish ahead of him later. So yeah, give me your thoughts down below if you agree with my take or if you think I'm just too much of a Charles Leclerc fan. Next up is Daniel Ricciardo. And I am putting Daniel ahead of Albon in inconsistent. I still believe that Daniel was unceremoniously dropped. I don't think he was performing bad enough to lose his seat. I think it was just politicking and external circumstances that meant that he left the sport instead of getting Checo's seat. Inconsistent is a great word for him because apart from the Alpines in Brazil, probably the two of the more impressive midfield drives this year, with his 4th place sprint finish in Miami and then I can't remember where he actually finished in Canada, but he qualified P5, I think, in Canada, and those were both very, very good drives from him considering how bad the RB car was this year. But other than that, he was getting knocked out in Q1 a lot and just wasn't quite competing to Yuki's level in qualifying. I think in race pace and like race finishes, they were about equal. It was just unfortunate that Daniel got better once the RB got worse. Only have him ahead of Albon because Albon crashed so much, and Daniel caused one of those crashes in Japan. But other than that, I think Daniel's just a little bit better at wheel-to-wheel racing and kind of getting the car to reach the limit but not go over. Next up is Esteban, and Esti Bestie I have in inconsistent as well. Obviously, Brazil was maybe one of the drives of the season, but he had an incredibly tough second half. I think part of this is due to Alpine probably gearing the car more in Gasly's direction, giving Gasly upgrades first. But at the start of the year, at least, I think when the car was really bad, he was outperforming Pierre. But yeah, I think it was kind of tough to really evaluate him at points just because of how bad that car was. But he was also, I think he seems to be the aggressor in the contentious relationship between him and Gasly, especially we saw that in Monaco. And yeah, I think overall SD didn't really have that great of a season. He only had 6 points outside of that second place in Brazil, whereas Gasly had a lot more points than that. All right, next up is Colapinto, and Colapinto I'm also putting it inconsistent right behind Esteban. Colapinto was maybe one of the most unexpected stories from this year, where he came in to replace Logan Sargeant with absolutely no pressure on his back, and he just hit the ground running. He was qualifying incredibly well, even out qualifying Alex, and was doing really well in the races as well. But with that success came expectations and the potential for a seat, and then he started to struggle. I also think that he lost his grandfather around Brazil, and so I think that might have also impacted his performances, which is unfortunate. But I do think Franco will be the first choice for any team looking to change one of their rookies out in 2024. I think the number and severity of crashes towards the end of the year, I think, really hampered the hype level around him. But yeah, I think it's been a long time since we've seen a driver come in to F1 with the amount of riz that Colapinto has, and I'm so here for it. We need the flirtiness back in F1. Okay, next up is George Russell, and I have George at the top end of standout. He had a pretty good season, all things considered. He outperformed Lewis when the car wasn't good and absolutely demolished him in qualifying. He was able to get a couple race wins in Austria, which was kind of a luck one, but also Vegas, where he did really well. And then he had one of the drives of the season in Spa until he got disqualified for being underweight, which is so unfortunate. But yeah, I think, just got unlucky there. I think at times he does make mistakes. I think of Australia with him losing it behind Fernando on one of the last laps of the race. But yeah, I think George just really impressed this year, especially in a year where he knew that he was going to have to step up and become that top driver at Mercedes once Lewis leaves. Next up is Jack Doohan. Jack, I don't even know where to put him because we only saw one race from him, so I'm just gonna put him in inconsistent, even though that's not really a word that you could use to describe someone who only did one race. But I think he was kind of anonymous in his Abu Dhabi debut, and so I'm hoping that he is able to prove himself more in 2025. Next up is Kevin Magnussen, and Kevin, I am also throwing an inconsistent just above Jack. Kevin had a terrible start to the year with the number of crashes that he was causing and just being way too overly aggressive. but he was also an incredible team player, helping Nico get points on several occasions. He also finished in P12 5 times, which kind of shows that he was kind of poor in qualifying compared to Nico, but was always able to make up positions in the races, especially in a Haas car that was stronger in 2024. They also missed a race because of a race ban. What a legend. And it ended up being Baku, which was a track that Ollie was known for being good at, so it was almost fortuitous timing with that. And yeah, he also missed Brazil because he was sick, which is kind of a bummer because of his one pole position that he got there. And I think that's also where he got his podium, if I recall correctly. Maybe I'm misremembering there. But yeah, his second half of the season, once he lost his seat though, was so much better. He was driving a lot better. He wasn't as aggressive. He was managing to out-qualify Nico more and was able to put it into a points finish more frequently. In the US sprint race and in Mexico, he finished 7th in both, and he was doing really well in Abu Dhabi as well until Valtteri basically took him out. I think Kevin is a presence that we're kind of going to miss in the grid next year. I think his shenanigans at the start of the year were kind of one of the few good parts of the races at that point of the season before the McLaren got good. So I think I'm going to miss his chaotic energy. Next up is Lance Stroll, and Lance is the first driver I'm putting in get out leave. He had at best an anonymous season and at worst a terrible season, especially beaching it in Brazil. I still can't believe how dim-witted of a moment that was. And just like after all the effort the mechanics put in to fix his car, and he just like steers it right into the gravel. Like, use your brain, sir. Like, it's clearly gonna get beached if you do that. And just what an embarrassing moment. He also had 0 points in the second half of the year because the Aston Martin tailed off and he just couldn't get anything out of it in the way that Alonso could. He also had that moment in China where he rammed into the back of Daniel under the safety car. And so yeah, just overall a very, very poor season from Lance, who didn't really have a single standout race. Next up is Lando Norris. And Lando I am putting in cut above as well. Lando, I think, can take a lot of learning out of 2024. I think he knows now that he needs to be better at race starts and holding on to those pole positions, because he made so many mistakes under pressure. Yeah, just kept making little mistakes here and there that cost him several positions, or just would allow Max through, and then he just couldn't get ahead of Max. And so I think Lando took a lot of learning out of that, and then also how to battle Max, because Max definitely got the better of him in their wheel-to-wheel combat, only because Lando seems to refuse to try to go down the inside. Other than those mistakes, I think Lando had a very, very good season, so we should also credit him for being able to perform well in that McLaren car. Next up is Lewis Hamilton, and I have Lewis at the top end of good, even though I would honestly say that this is probably Lewis's worst season in F1. He was just completely demolished by George in qualifying, but he was always able to make it back up in the race and still finish right next to George. And he had a few stand-up performances in, obviously, Silverstone, which he ended up winning, and Belgium, which he won by default. But yeah, I think, especially in the second half of the season, he really struggled. And I don't know if it was just fatigue and just wanting to move on to Ferrari, but yeah, he definitely had a rough season. Next up is Liam Lawson, and I am throwing him behind Daniel Ricciardo in inconsistent. That might be a take as well. Liam got out-qualified 6-0 by Yuki. At least qualifying ended up being pretty close to 50-50 between Daniel and Yuki, and Daniel also was able to be close to Yuki in terms of race finishes. If you're looking at Liam overall in the races that he got in 2023 and 2024, I would put him ahead of Daniel, but I think if you're just looking at 2024, I don't think Liam did all that great. I think he had a good performance at the US GP and in Brazil in the wet conditions, but other than that, he was getting into a lot of either collisions or battles with other people. A lot of people were getting upset with him for how he was racing, and he wasn't qualifying that great, obviously from his record against Yuki. And so I think if he had more races, maybe he would have been able to impress more, or at least more races that he's raced at previously. I don't think he did all that great this year, which makes the fact that he got the Red Bull seat even tougher to swallow compared to Yuki. Next up is Logan Sargeant, and he is going in get-out leave as well. It was pretty clear that Logan just isn't a driver that's cut out for F1, and he had one good race in Silverstone to finish P11. It kept him out of the bottom of the driver standings for a big chunk of the season, but yeah, he just made a lot of crashes, especially in free practice where you do not want to crash. That's kind of the number one thing. They had so little faith in him that they replaced him with Alex in Australia after Alex totaled his own car. It was great having Logan around. He made for a great meme, but I think his time is done. Next up is Max Verstappen, and I have Max in cut above between Charles and Lando. This might be a take. I think Max, clearly with the way that he was able to get the most out of that Red Bull car, even when it was a terrible car, was very impressive. I think he had the drive of his career in Brazil. I think he was able to make the most of the Red Bull when it was the best car at the start of the season. But outside of that, I think Max made a lot of mistakes this year, and I think he showed weakness, which is something that hasn't been the case in the past, 2 seasons. And so I think of his moments in Mexico battling with Lando. I think of his crash in Abu Dhabi. I think of races like Monaco where he kind of struggled, and then kind of the midpoint of the season where he kind of had a dip and wasn't able to deal with the car as well as the past. Yeah, this is a take, but I think Charles had the more consistent season. And Max clearly had higher highs, but I think he had lower lows as well. So I would put him and Charles extremely equal. This is a take, and I'm sure you will all have something to say about it in the comments. But I think Charles's consistency, and I think how much this season he has proved that he is ready to be a world champion, is what has made it so impressive for me. Whereas Max, I think, took a step down in his impressive level because of the mistakes and the weaknesses that he showed this year, even though he showed his strengths as well. I hope that all makes sense. Okay, next up is Nico Hulkenberg, and I have Nico at the tail end of standout. Nico did incredibly well in that Haas. Once that Haas was able to figure out their tire issues and testing, he was able to make the most of his fantastic qualifying to get so many points finishes. He had the most P11 finishes probably of anyone in history with 7, and he was really good in a lot of the races to squeak out points, but he also had a few really poor races. Brazil wasn't that great. Qatar was really bad, but other than that, he was lower level of the points, P11, very, very consistent driver. All right, next up is Ollie Bearman, and Ollie I'm putting at the tail end of good. Clearly, Ollie did super well in 2 of his 3 races that he had. To finish in the points in both a Haas and a Ferrari is very impressive, and the first driver to ever do that in his first 2 races for 2 different teams, so that's very well done by him. His race in Brazil, though, was awful, and I think that just came down to the fact that it was his first race in wet conditions in an F1 car. He was going off a lot and just didn't drive very well that race. I think at least he managed to finish the race, which is better than his teammate and some of the other rookies, but yeah, I think overall it was very impressive 3 races from Ollie, and so he should be pretty happy with that and should set him up well for his full-time race seat in 2025. Next up is Oscar Piastri, and Oscar I am putting just behind Carlos in standout. I think Oscar had a tough start to the year and a really tough finish to the year, but the middle part of his season, he looked like a world championship driver. So if he can figure out how to maintain that level of racing for an entire year, I think Lando Norris might be in trouble. Yeah, I think his Hungary drive was incredibly impressive. Baku was unbelievable. And yeah, a lot of those European races just went so well for him. But the end of the season, he was making a lot of mistakes, wasn't qualifying very well compared to Lando. I don't know if it was fatigue or if it was not wanting to have to support Lando in his drivers' championship battle, but yeah, I think Oscar really struggled in those last few races. However, one thing you can say about Oscar this season is that he has become one of 4 drivers who has managed to finish every single lap in an F1 season. He didn't have a single DNF and he never got lapped, which is very, very impressive, especially in your second season in F1. Next up is Pierre Gasly, and I have Pierre at the top end of good. This might be a bit of a take, but I take a driver's full season into account and not just the most recent races. I think if you were looking at only the last quarter of the year, you would probably put Pierre in at the top end of standout, but Pierre had a very, very bad start to 2024. I think people forget about this because it was when the Alpine was bad and no one can remember anything that happened back in March and April, but yeah, he was getting consistently outqualified and outraced by Ocon. It was just not going well, but as the car got better and as the team kind of developed more in his direction, he just got better and better. And then yeah, those last 6 races of the year, he was so impressive, and that's what's pushed him to the top end of good for me. Yeah, Brazil and Qatar and Abu Dhabi were all highlights for him. And he's also the first driver to not have any damage for a whole season, or at least damage he caused. So yeah, just a very, very consistent, very good wheel-to-wheel racer. And I think he'll do well in the Alpine next year with a full season of a better car. Okay, next up I have Checo Perez, and Checo is going straight into leave get out. I have him just ahead of Lance though. Checo just infuriates me. I'm so over talking about him. They should have replaced him with Daniel at the mid-break, because at least we would have been able to see what Daniel was capable of. But Checo was awful the rest of the season. The one race he was good was Baku, and he ended up crashing with Carlos on the last lap. So it's just, yeah, the hate watch was a great time for me. Yeah, I think he did very, very well at the start of the season, and that's the only reason why I have him ahead of Stroll and Logan. But yeah, after he signed his new contract, he just fell off a cliff in terms of performance, and I'm so glad that he's gone, because I was just so tired of talking about it year after year after year. Next up is Valtteri Bottas, and Bottas I'm putting in leave get out just ahead of Checo. Yeah, this isn't necessarily because Bottas should get out. I just can't put him in inconsistent, because he was consistent, he was just consistently not there. I think it was unfortunate that when Valtteri was driving well, the car was awful, and then when the car was actually okay, like it was in China and maybe Bahrain at the start of the season, he was running either into Sauber being terrible in the pit stops, reliability issues, or he was just not doing a very good job. I think Joe did a better job than him in the sense of, on the races where the Sauber was good, Joe was actually able to capitalize on that. Bottas did not. But I think overall, over the course of the season, Valtteri did a much better job and consistently outqualified Joe. But yeah, I think it is time for Bottas to take a break. I think being a reserve at Mercedes is probably going to be a good spot for him, and I'm sure he'll jump at the opportunity to get back in F1 if any of the rookie drivers don't do very well. All right, next up is Yuki Tsunoda, and Yuki I am throwing in good just behind Lewis. I don't know what else Yuki could have done to prove that he deserves that Red Bull seat. He's beaten every single teammate he's had. He's been quite consistent, and when the RB wasn't screwing him over with race strategy or poor development, he was actually performing quite well. He outperformed his teammate in qualifying for the most part. I think Daniel was a little closer, but he went 6-0 against Liam. Yeah, he also had a bit of an unlucky season where he was taken out a lot by other people, especially in the second half of the season. And Brazil was actually very impressive, because I didn't know Yuki as someone who was good in wet weather, but in that race he if the RB team hadn't put him on wets before the VSC, I think he could have had a podium position finish there ahead of the Alpines. So yeah, just a little bit unfortunate luck there for Yuki, but otherwise I think he did a very good job in a very substandard car. And finally, the last driver on my list is Zhou Guanyu, and Zhou I am putting ahead of Stroll, but behind Checo. I think Zhou's qualifying was absolutely atrocious. He finished P20 in so many races in 2024, but he was always able to make up positions in the races, so much so that I think he was in the top 3 in terms of most positions gained by a driver over the season, which is kind of an interesting stat, although part of that's probably because since he was finishing P20, anytime anyone DNF'd, he would be moving up. And then I think he was also able to capitalize once the stake was good. In Qatar and almost in Las Vegas, he was able to do quite well, and Bahrain as well. But yeah, I think Zhou has proved to be a very consistent and cautious driver, but I think for that reason he just didn't show very much pace over the course of his F1 career, and I hope he gets a development role somewhere. I think that would be a good fit for him. And he just seems like such a nice dude, so hoping the best for him in the future. Anyways, that is my driver ranking for 2024. This is the full list. I always like to kind of compare where they were at the start of the season versus the end. I think overall, Lewis definitely dropped this year compared to the start of the season. I think Hulkenberg rose a little bit. Albon definitely fell quite a bit. And Checo, I didn't think he could fall any further, but he did. So anyways, if you've enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys around.